Professor Sachs, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Let me begin by reading a quote coming from Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, responding to the latest remarks by the Japanese Prime Minister, which the Chinese said crossed the red line. Here's what he said, quote, "It is shocking that Japan's current leaders have publicly sent the wrong signal of attempting military intervention in the Taiwan issue, said things that they shouldn't have said, and crossed a red line that they should not have been touched." And here's a quote coming from the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. As someone who has been watching the region very closely over the years, Professor Sachs, your response to why the Chinese have been very serious about the Japanese remark lately?
I think we must start from the point of view that the tensions over Taiwan are real, partly because of Taiwan's domestic politics and statements that are provocative by politicians in Taiwan. When it comes to Japan, it is the fact that over the last 10 years, Japan has become less pacifist, more military oriented. It is raising its military spending. It talks in a more hawkish way, none of which, to my mind, makes sense for Japan's interests. No doubt the tensions have risen in the last 10 years, and Japan's pacifism after World War II is in many ways a thing of the past. It's not that Japan is flagrantly militaristic, but it is becoming more military oriented, rising military spending, rising tensions, and the statement that Prime Minister Takaichi made is consistent with the hardline faction of her party that she represents.
Should people accept a Japan that is much more militaristic than it used to be? After all, Japan has been the one that started the invasion against its neighbors, whether it's on the Korean Peninsula, against China, Southeast Asia, millions of lives lost as a result of that war. And we are also seeing war criminals, their ashes are being put into the Yasukuni Shrine, in which some of the prime ministers of Japan still go there and pray for those. Some are Class A war criminals. So should the world, should the region, including China, just accept a ever more militarized Japan and ever more militarist Japan?
When it comes to Japan, it is the sad history that when Japan industrialized first among the Asian countries in the late 19th century, it joined the so-called imperialist club of European imperial powers. It invaded China in 1894-95. That's when actually Taiwan became temporarily a colony of Japan, when Korea became a colony of Japan. And then Japan brutally invaded China from the 1930s onward, and well over 10 million Chinese people died from that. It was horrific. The cruelty was immense. The suffering was immense. We should be remembering this not by militarist language or divides, but by saying everything should be done to make peace in Northeast Asia. There should not be any division, in fact, of China on one side and Japan on the other side. That's partly a U.S. post-World War II creation. The U.S. quickly helped Japan to rebuild after Japan's militarism, in part as a supposed bulwark against Soviet and Chinese communism. That was the U.S. idea. But Japan never really came to grips, I would say, with what it had done in repeated wars in East Asia and in Southeast Asia. And the militarism is dangerous and anachronistic, and it should have no place in our world today.
We not only see rhetoric coming from the Japanese prime minister, but also follow-up decisions made by Japan. For example, the latest remarks coming from the defense minister suggesting the deployment of missiles in in the places near China's Taiwan island.
A military buildup by Japan and possibly triggering a major arms race or the worst disaster, a military conflict, is completely against the real interest of Japan. It's against the interest of the world.
But we're seeing the other way around, Professor. It seems that politicians, especially those domestically weak, for example, the current prime minister, when she came into power, she is having a coalition government and therefore she's weak. And there's likely to be a parliamentary election not favorable to her coalition. So we see someone who is trying to play with political opportunist approach. And that might be to her interest politically, but certainly not to her country's long-term peace and stability, and not to her neighbors' long-term peace and stability.
I think that it also absolutely must be recognized that the United States has a major role in this. The United States, as Japan's security protection, should be saying strongly to Japan, don't go there, don't do this, don't stir up trouble. The United States, as the major counterpart power here, should be saying very clearly to Prime Minister Takaichi and to the Japanese counterparts, do not do this. We don't want another war. We don't want to encourage imprudent behavior by anybody. We don't want to encourage accidents or stoking up extreme nationalism that can get us into horrible trouble.
Recently, US President Donald Trump made a phone call to the Japanese Prime Minister. Both sides have not revealed the content of the phone call. Your perspective on how responsible the United States needs to be to make sure its allies are not crossing the red line and put both the United States and others in the region at danger.
Well, the first thing is the United States itself must not cross the red line because the U.S. has been coming pretty close to China's red lines over the last 10 years. The U.S. adopted a far harsher, I would say even anti-China policy starting around a decade ago. And Trump's trade war against China this year was part of that. But there has seemed very fragile and very uncertain, but there seems to have been a U.S. stepping back from that in recent months and even in recent days. It seems that the U.S. is beginning to understand something, which is that China's not going to be cowed. China is not going to succumb to U.S. choke points because they don't exist. China holds a lot of potential choke points like the rare earth magnets vis-a-vis the U.S. And Western economies. And it seems that the U.S. has toned down some of its rather harsh anti-China rhetoric, even in the past weeks and days. On the U.S. side, there was no defense of the Japanese prime minister. There was no running to her defense. There was no anti-China rhetoric. Quite the contrary. What the United States has said in recent days is we want to get back to good relations, and President Trump wants to make a visit to China. And so that's good news. This is very important.
According to the latest phone call between China and the U.S. President, the Chinese readout suggests that Chinese President Xi Jinping emphasized to the U.S. President Donald Trump, China and the U.S. fought side by side against fascism and militarism. Now they should work together to safeguard the achievements of the victory in World War II. Now, certainly, it seems many analysts suggest what Chinese President Xi Jinping is trying to say is the issue about Taiwan and also about the regional order after the World War II should be jointly not only mutually understood to China and the United States, but also jointly defended by China and the United States.
Well, I think there's something very profound in the statement, and it even goes beyond the China-U.S. relations. There were actually four major powers in World War II fighting together. That was the United States, the Soviet Union, especially mainly Russia, Britain, and China. And this was an alliance against the German-Japanese fascism. And it could and should have continued after World War II. Instead, a Cold War developed. The relations broke down. But what President Xi is rightly reminding us is that the US and China were on the same side in World War II. Actually, I want to just add that Russia and the United States were on the same side during World War II. We should remember that. That's not just a footnote of history. That is the possibility of how the great powers could actually, even today, say, we have shared interests. We even have a shared history. We have been allies in the past, and we should be allies, if I could put it that way, going forward.
Professor, after Chinese and U.S. president's phone call, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson suggesting that conversation taking place on the phone, which lasted for an hour, are three words: positive, friendly, constructive. Now, how would you understand the series of adjectives used by the Chinese side to describe that phone call? And what does that mean to indicate to you about China's attitude of continuous communication with the U.S. side?
We have a very ambiguous situation right now and a very unstable situation. It has been a decade in which the United States overtly went on a contain China policy. We had the same vis-a-vis Russia. There are hints, again, I don't want to overread it, but there are hints that President Trump, in his own approach, actually wants good relations among the major powers. He often is quite belligerent against small countries, but he has this tendency to see that there should be at least a normalcy with President Putin and Russia and with President Xi and China. I believe, again, we're guessing, but he may be trying to steer away from the overtly neoconservative hardline approach of the past decade.
After talking about the phone call by the Chinese side, we also saw a tweet by the US President in his X account talking about the relationship with China, quote, is extremely good, end of quote. How would you understand the timing and also the degree of the descriptions he's trying to put into a public statement?
Again, the broad direction of U.S. policy during the last 10 years is usually, and I think rightly described as a containment policy, that the U.S. was trying to contain China. I regard that policy as absurd. I don't think the United States can or should, quote, contain China. But that was the dominant thinking in foreign policy circles and in Congress and in the rhetoric politically in the United States. But I do see signs, as I am emphasizing, that this is being rethought. It is a losing strategy for the United States to go in that direction. And I think that the United States, at least the foreign policy executive branch, the president, the National Security Council, the State Department, the Pentagon, I hope, are all thinking maybe that wasn't the right thing. We can't win trade wars. We can't win hot wars. We shouldn't go in that direction. I do see a change in tone and in rhetoric and in tweets in recent weeks that suggests to me a kind of reconsideration.
But Professor, as you know, there are several concerns from the Chinese side. For example, the technological blockade the U.S. has been exercising against China, for example, about chips and artificial intelligence. There's also the investment opportunities, whether Chinese companies could have equal ones inside the United States. Meanwhile, export bans, and the list goes on. So how do you see these questions coming from the Chinese side being addressed by the U.S. side so far?
I don't think there's going to be a consistent and stable and open policy for years to come, probably. The mood in Washington is protectionist. It remains surly. It's a little bit more realistic now than it was a few months ago because of the fact that China said no, we're not accepting that approach. But I don't think that we're going to have smooth, open, totally positive relations. There is, from the U.S. perspective, a heated competition underway, and that means that it's not going to be smooth. And technology competition will continue. My own view is that China is making amazing breakthroughs, one after another, on technology. So even if the chips don't exactly match in China, NVIDIA's chips, China's finding all sorts of breakthrough ways with quantum photonics, with new computer designs, with many breakthroughs, fundamental breakthroughs, it seems, being announced week by week right now.
Thinking about the April visit by U.S. President to China, and later the interactions likely between the two presidents, whether it is at APEC or G20 or another visit by Chinese president to the United States later next year. How do you see both sides can work out some specific plans in order to make sure that these occasions are being nurtured beforehand in terms of ambience?
It's pretty clear to Donald Trump and to the political class in Washington that if you take a trip to China, you want it to go well. That's a major occasion. It's a major occasion of protocol and ceremony and mutual respect across countries. It's not only a visit by a particular leader. So if we have this visit, that augurs well for actually trying to clear the way for a better 2026.